curioso para aprender com um dos maiores professores do mundo. Hoje, às 8 horas da noite, Daniel Zibblat, professor de Harvard, autor de Como as Democracias, vai dar uma aula inédita, exclusiva e traduzida para o português aqui no ICL. À noite a gente se vê. Olá, meus amigos, minhas amigas, ou como eu costumo falar, meu irmão, minha irmã. É assim que várias pessoas chegam na rua e carinhosamente vêm falar comigo, né? Por causa desse meu jeito de falar assim, aprendido no meu bom e velho Rio de Janeiro. Não estou lá mais há 20 anos, mas o Rio de Janeiro não saiu de mim. A gente hoje à noite tem um encontro muito especial mesmo. Uma aula histórica para o ICL. A gente hoje vai parar para ouvir e aprender, né? E não significa que temos que concordar, significa que temos a oportunidade de aprender, né? E aí, enfim, desenvolver o nosso próprio pensamento crítico. E o nosso senso crítico ele só pode ser bem desenvolvido quando a gente aprende, tem aulas e é colocado em contato com cabeças pensantes que sejam, né, bem preparadas, que sejam bem intencionadas, que tenham um histórico de se dedicarem aos temas que ensinam. E eu digo isso porque muita gente hoje se coloca como especialista em assuntos e são pessoas que caíram de paraquedas, mas que são boas de marketing ali. Não, aqui a gente está falando de um professor de Harvard, que é um dos autores mais vendidos no planeta e que escreveu esse livro, né, que é um dos livros mais vendidos do planeta também. Só que vocês que já leram o livro devem estar achando alguma coisa estranha. O livro não tem esse nome. O livro não é Como Salvar as Democracias. O livro do professor Daniel Zibblat chama-se Como as Democracias Morrem. E esse era o nome da aula de hoje. Como as Democracias Morrem. Só que a gente teve que mudar o nome da aula de hoje. Sabe por que a gente teve que mudar o nome da aula de hoje? A gente teve que mudar o nome da aula de hoje porque a Meta, né, que é a dona do Facebook, é a dona do Instagram, é a dona do WhatsApp, que é onde a gente anuncia, a gente divulga esses nossos encontros super especiais, ela proibiu a gente de anunciar a aula com o nome Como as Democracias Morrem. E isso já mostra um pouco em que tipo de mundo a gente está vivendo, né? Como quando uma plataforma proíbe uma aula que tem o nome de um livro, que é um dos livros mais vendidos do mundo, e que fala sobre assim, uma explicação de como morrem as democracias, a mesma empresa que mudou várias das suas regras depois que Donald Trump assumiu nos Estados Unidos e começou a proibir que universidades, né, falassem qualquer coisa que fosse contra, por exemplo, né, ao massacre promovido por Israel na Palestina e coisas com as quais Donald Trump não concordava ou não se alinhava, a gente começa a ver um dos sinais do perigo que o mundo passa hoje. E várias dessas coisas vão ser debatidas nessa aula de hoje, que é uma aula onde a gente selecionou vários temas dos livros do Daniel Zibblat, mas também temas que são temas quentes do momento, aqui do Brasil, dos Estados Unidos e de mundo, para a gente poder trazer até vocês aí enfim, a opinião desse que é um cara muito importante da gente separar um tempo para ouvir. Mas a noite de hoje é ainda mais especial. A gente vai ouvir essa aula, Como Salvar as Democracias, uma aula que demora uns 50 minutos, exatamente o tempo que demora uma aula numa faculdade, num colégio, etc. Depois disso, né, a gente vai até no finalzinho anunciar que temos hoje à noite uma nova estreia dentro da plataforma ICL, mais um original ICL, um documentário original feito pelo ICL, que nem vocês veem, original Netflix, original Amazon Prime. A gente está cada dia mais com uma produção assim super rica e cada vez mais numerosa de originais ICL, com uma qualidade cada vez melhor. O último que a gente apresentou foi aquela Quanto Custam os Ricos no Brasil, que é um sucesso estrondoso de audiência, também está na nossa plataforma ICL. Então, terminando essa aula de hoje, eu vou falar para vocês qual o novo documentário que a gente vai ter. Até vou mostrar o trailer em primeira mão para todo mundo hoje. E a gente vai ter uma conversa aqui, olha que privilégio, sobre o que a gente vai assistir nessa aula. A gente vai ter uma conversa com José Sócrates, ex-primeiro-ministro de Portugal, que é uma cabeça brilhante e que vai, com certeza, enriquecer ainda mais essa nossa noite. Então, a aula Como Salvar as Democracias, né? Eu vou apresentar rapidamente para vocês o que é o Instituto Conhecimento Liberta, esse instituto que hoje em dia é líder absoluto no jornalismo brasileiro, na internet e nas manhãs. Hoje em dia, durante as manhãs, tem audiência maior do que vários canais que estão há muito tempo aí, que tem, enfim, muito dinheiro por trás, como o CNN. Em várias manhãs a gente tem audiência maior do que a Globo News também, temos audiência maior que a Band na internet, maior do que o SBT na internet. Então, a gente vai apresentar para vocês o que é esse ecossistema revolucionário que está sendo, e isso é verdade, isso que eu estou falando para vocês, está sendo observado pelo mundo inteiro, e várias pessoas do mundo inteiro têm entrado em contato com a gente para tentar entender como a gente está conseguindo levar para as pessoas informação sem ter patrocínio, sem ter dinheiro de governo, sem ter dinheiro de empresa e tendo uma independência total, né? Então, a gente vai apresentar, vai fazer um convite para quem quiser fazer parte da comunidade ICL, que tem acesso, hoje em dia, já a mais de 400 cursos e documentários, são mais de 5.000 aulas com os maiores professores do mundo, tudo em português para vocês assistirem, aulas do Noam Chomsky, do Michael Sandel, do nosso saudoso Domênico de Masi, do Cornel West. Vai ter, eu vou anunciar para vocês, uma aula magna do Daniel Zibblat, diferente dessa que vocês vão ver hoje, é uma aula histórica sobre o processo de como as democracias morrem, também já na plataforma. Então, vocês vão receber um convite muito especial para fazer parte do ICL com a gente hoje. E eu acho que vocês vão gostar muito. E eu acho que quase todo mundo que está aqui assistindo vai entrar no ICL hoje com, enfim, o que a gente preparou para vocês. E vai ter essa conversa com o nosso querido ex-primeiro-ministro de Portugal, José Sócrates. Uma noite histórica, uma noite especial, num dia muito importante para o país, né? Hoje a gente está testemunhando uma das maiores operações contra o crime organizado no Brasil e que não deveria ser surpresa para ninguém, né? Acaba envolvendo essas investigações bancos da Faria Lima, fintechs, corretoras, facções do crime organizado, enfim, aquilo tudo que a gente sabe, postos de gasolina que a gente fala há tanto tempo, né? Coisas que a gente fala há tanto tempo e a gente fica esperando dias como hoje. Então, que dia especial, que dia histórico, que dia importante para a nossa democracia e que a gente celebre esse dia hoje, assistindo essa aula e depois participando desse debate onde vocês vão poder mandar perguntas também com o ex-primeiro-ministro de Portugal. É o ICL fazendo revolução E o ICL é essa comunidade toda junto. Boa aula para vocês e daqui a pouquinho eu volto ao vivo com vocês. Ah, e uma última coisa. Como essa aula ela foi assim escondida, né, pela dona da rede social, pelo dono da rede social, eu vou pedir para vocês agora, se puderem, divulgar isso. É uma aula que o Brasil inteiro precisava assistir, sabe? Realmente, ter uma aula com o Daniel Zibblat é uma aula que o Brasil inteiro precisava assistir. Então, se você puder pegar o link agora, mandar nos seus grupos de WhatsApp e falar, caraca, vai começar uma aula agora fenomenal com um dos maiores professores de Harvard, etc., no ICL, não perde essa chance, não. Manda para todo mundo, tira uma foto, põe ali no seu Instagram, né? E marca o ICL que o pessoal vai conseguir assistir, porque é isso que faz a gente dar a nossa contribuição para a gente fazer um mundo melhor e lutar contra esses absurdos que estão acontecendo. Um abraço e até daqui a pouco. Hello everyone, I'm really happy to have with us here today very important and acclaimed professor from United States. He's a political science professor. He teaches in Harvard University, and he's also a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin. And he's well known in the whole world for his books. The most famous one, How Democracies Die, but he's also an author and co-author of many other books like Tyranny of Minority. We have with us Daniel Zibblat. Hello, Professor, how are you doing? We're honored to have you here at ICL.
Absolutely thrilled to be with you. I'm really excited for the conversation.
I'll start with this kind of obvious question, but that's the most famous quote from your books, is that not necessarily democracies die with tanks and weapons. Many times they die, I mean, with people going to the ballots and voting. So I would like you to tell us a little bit about that, because in Brazil, we experienced something very peculiar in the world. I think United States experienced something very similar to Brazil, but there were no tanks on the streets. There were no weapons being pointed to anyone, but we suffered a very severe threat to our democratic regime here in Brazil. Tell us, how does democracy dies now in 2025?
Yeah, so it's, the picture that we have, many people have, at least if you grew up during the Cold War, is this picture of tanks coming in, president in the presidential palace being, assassinated, or airplanes flying overhead and dropping bombs and this kind of thing. And that, that is in fact accurately, military coups was 2/3 of democratic breakdowns during the Cold War between 1945 and 1989 took this form. But really, after the collapse of communism and the global wave of democracy that took place after this, because elections became so widespread in part, it's not as if authoritarianism disappeared, but it took on a new form, took on a new costume. And politicians got elected to office, and so in some sense often had democratic credentials because they've been elected. But then once in office, acted in ways that we could say are not democratic. And they entrench themselves in rule, undermine competition, make it harder for the other side to win, weaponize the state against the opposition. And so if you look to a country like Viktor Orban's Hungary, he's been in power since 2010. Erdogan in Turkey. There's other places around Chavez and Venezuela. I mean, there's been places all around the world where people come to power through elections, but then once in power, abuse the democratic system. Sometimes, this is a relatively new form, but what's interesting also is that it's, in some ways, it's like this movie Back to the Future. We've gone back to the past in a certain way, because before the Cold War in the 1930s, this was often how autocrats came into power. And there was a famous German political scientist writing in the 1930s describing how the fascists came into power in the 1920s and 1930s using the ballot box. And what he said was that democracy is like a Trojan horse. It enters into the gate of the city in disguise, and it can be abused. And so the challenge is how to identify the threats and how to defend a democracy against those threats.
It's good that you brought the German example here, because many people, when they look at Orbán, when they look at Jair Bolsonaro, when they look at Donald Trump, they say that the supporters of those political leaders are neo-Nazis or they are fascists. Do you think it's an adequate expression to use? Or it's something different? It reminds some of the characteristics, but it's something different. Do we have fascism back to the political arena?
Yeah, I tend not to use the word fascism when talking about contemporary politics. Not because, I mean, there are some similarities, but I do think that, and there's historians and political scientists debate this, whether they should use it or not. And I tend not to use it because I think that it distracts us from certain features of the political system today. And so if you take a case like Orban in Hungary, there's not mass use of violence to gain power. There's no massive cheating at election. It's much more a process of weaponizing the state and using the law in ways to weaken the opposition by opening investigations of, let's say, political parties or politicians that have no basis, or opening investigations into business, or making threats to business leaders that unless you support us, we're not going to approve this regulation, we're not going to give you this license, making threats to media organizations, if you report too negatively about us, we're not going to approve your merger with this other media company. So using law and using legalistic methods to make it so that it becomes harder and harder to beat the opposition, because then you don't want to criticize the opposition because you have to sort of think twice about it. And so if you live in a society, in a full democracy, you should be able to criticize the government at basically no price and no cost. You shouldn't have to think twice about it. But if you live in a political system in which you begin to think twice about it, you say, well, I might, my business contract may take let's say you're the CEO of a company. If, I'm responsible to my shareholders, if I criticize the government, maybe there's going to be a cost for my company, so I better not say it. Or you own a media company, I better not allow this editorial to be written because this will make us look bad and we'll come under attention. So in these ways, it's kind of using the law to intimidate the opposition. Now, that said, there's differences. I mean, who's to say where these regimes will end up? I mean, I think in many ways, we do see some political violence in the United States. There was a murder of politicians, and the greater the role of violence in the political system, and especially disorganized violence. That's like violence not organized by the state, but by kind of supporters, paramilitary groups. Then that begins to verge into something that more looks like fascism. And I wouldn't rule that out as something that's possible in principle, but I kind of reserve that term for describing that. Now, in terms of your question though was about the voters, and I think that's a very excellent question. I mean, do you think of voters as being fascist? I mean, I tend not to focus as much on voters. I mean, I think voters vote for all sorts of reasons. Voters often vote for candidates and politicians who end up being autocratic because they're frustrated with the status quo. I mean, and in a certain way, that's what's supposed to happen in a democracy. If you don't like the incumbent, if you don't like the status quo, then you're supposed to vote for the other party. And so, especially in a two-party system, if one of those parties happens to be a party that's going to behave in undemocratic ways, then that's a real problem, because if you may not like the government, then your only other option is to vote for this other party. So people don't, I think, really vote for authoritarianism in most cases. There's not the kind of clear ideologies that there was, let's say, in the 20s and 30s. In most instances. But, unless one's alert to the value of democracy, though, you'll be indifferent to the threats to democracy.
Yeah, it's good that you gave this example, that one of the weapons of those regimes is to assassinate reputations using the media, the social media, etc. Because a few weeks ago, the Federal Police of Brazil, they made public an investigation they did of a nucleus that they had on the Bolsonaro government that had the role to monitor and also to spread false information on people that were against him. And the only media company that was on the 1,000 pages report was ICL, our institution. They made a report with assumed false information to assassinate our reputation because we were against Bolsonaro. But Bolsonaro also incentivized all his supporters to buy guns, and almost 1 million people bought guns in his term, and they were legal because he made it legal for people to do that. He used the polices of Brazil, putting people of his close circle to direct those polices. I see in the United States also Donald Trump now interfering in the power of the states with his national forces. Isn't it possible that they're not being as violent as those regimes were in the past because they're not on that stage? Isn't it possible that they're going to that stage, they're just not there yet?
Yeah, I think that's really the right way to think about. I mean, those are terrible stories that you're telling, Eduardo, about what's happened, and it does sound familiar to me. And I think that it's right. That there's some times that I think political scientists think about these things. They sort of think in overly static terms. They sort of have a checklist. Okay, these are the 6 attributes of fascism. Does this regime have this today? No. Check. Nope. Okay, so it's not fascist. Okay, now don't worry about it. But I think if you look historically as well, that regimes change over time, that when they adapt their strategies to try to consolidate power. And so I agree that it's possible. I mean, I don't know where, I can't predict the future, but I think it's possible that these regimes become more violent. As an authoritarian's popularity decreases, there's a great temptation to try to use violence to stay in power. I mean, so one of the things that I think is distinctive about the Trump presidency is that he, let's say, unlike the president of El Salvador, or unlike the president of Russia, who have 80% approval ratings, the American president has around a 40% approval rating. And so on the one hand, I think that's probably good for democracy because it's easier to do terrible things if you're extremely popular as an autocrat. On the other hand, if you look at President Yoon in South Korea, when he was at 19% approval rating, this is when he declared martial law. So I think there's a way in which, if you're really an autocrat and you're going to lose power, you're fearing you're going to lose power, there's greater temptation to rely on violence. And so, as these regimes develop, I think it's, who's to know where they will go. And I think you're right that there is this side of them that's not purely legalistic and following the law. There's a way in which they're happy to kind of try to use the mob, even if it's a kind of Twitter mob or social media mob, in some cases real mob, to go after people. And that's something that is more resonant of fascism.
It's one thing that is interesting, and I was kind of impacted by this report when I read it, is that people have different views on what democracy is and what democracy is for. I read a report from NIRA Data a few weeks ago, and one of their questions was, what is the purpose of democracy? And for my surprise, the least popular answer was being able to freely choose the government. That was the answer, with the smallest percentage of people answering that. The most answered for this question was improving living standards and well-being. Also, people answered promoting a fair and peaceful society, and protecting individual rights and freedoms also came with a small percentage. So we come to a question that is before, like, protecting democracy, which is, what are we protecting? Because people seem to be protecting different things. They seem to be looking at democracy and expecting something different from this regime. What should we consider democracy?
Yeah, no, very interesting. I mean, I think that that's right, that people, the meaning of democracy itself has changed over time. And in any given moment in time today, people have associate different things. And I've done some of these surveys myself of, opinion surveys, and find that people have very different ideas. Um, the way that political scientists tend to think about this, and I think there's some virtue in this. I mean, I don't think there's one definition that is good for all times and places. I mean, it is evolving. But, at its most basic level, democracy just means rule by the people. The problem with that, I mean, that's literally what it means. Demos is the people. Democracy, rule by the people. The problem with that is that that's too vague. Everybody claims to be any government can claim to be the,
Exactly.
government by the people.
Exactly.
The authoritarian government. So one has to go beyond that. And I think it's useful to think about it in terms of the way I think about it anyway, and I would make the case for this, is really centered on three main pillars. One is a pillar of participation. So that is inclusive participation. That's all citizens above a certain age can participate in politics by either voting, by running for office, by making their voices heard, and that you don't exclude any segment of the population from participating. A second big pillar in my mind, and this is going to put me in the minority of the poll you've mentioned, but this is where I am, I guess, is competition. So competition for power. It has to be a genuine, free, and fair competition for power. In a monarchy, you don't have competition for power. The king is the guy who has the power, or the queen is the woman who has the power, and then they pass power on to their child, and there's no competition for power. The essence of democracy is competition for power, and free and fair competition. Because if you have competition that benefits just one side, or that the rules are set up in a way that one side always wins, then that's not really good competition. And then the third big pillar, I would say, are a set of package of civil liberties and civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, that freedom of religion, these things that are essential to protect individual rights, that make the competition real, that make the participation real. So now that's kind of maybe like that's not, the definitions you said that most people think of, like improving life, making life more peaceful. These are all things that I think come through democracy. At some level, one way of thinking about it, the way I think about this anyway, is it's a set of procedures for how to organize your politics. And you have to agree on the rules. And then once you agree on the rules, then you can begin to have the fights over, okay, do we have higher taxes on wealthy people or lower taxes? Do we have stricter, clean air rules to protect the environment, or looser? Do we have how do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with public health? But if you can't even agree on the rules, then in fact you can't really address the problems. And so I think the idea is, so what's this have to do with rule by the people? I mean, my three kind of pillar definition is that the best way to try to grasp what the people want are to set in place these kinds of rules, because only in that way can you begin to approximate what the people, if such a thing really exists, want. So that's my definition. And I try to make the case in particular for competition, because you can think of it like an economic analogy. I'm not an economist, but if you have in a marketplace, if you have one company that dominates the market, then then the consumers don't get what they want, necessarily, and they entrench themselves in power. And people who are monopolists want to have all the economic power. And similarly in politics, people who have power want more power. They want to accumulate power. And the way to disable power, in a way, is to have competition for power. And so you need to have a set of rules in place to make sure the competition is fair. So that's how I think about it in any case.
No, that's a great point, because when you say that democracy implies a fair competition, I would ask you if there's any fair competition anywhere in the capitalist world, because you have such inequalities, like in Brazil, where some groups, they dominate the media. They now more than ever, the billionaires are buying all media companies, not only in the United States, but here in Brazil. Like just as an example, I read an article a few months ago, more than 70% of the economic news in Brazil that are read by people are from periodics and newspapers that are owned by banks. in Brazil. More than 70% of the economic news that people read are from magazines and newspapers owned by bankers. In the United States, the whole world saw that picture with the owners of the big tech companies at Donald Trump's inauguration ceremony. I mean, lining up with them. They changed their policies on their companies after Donald Trump. So what is the role of the elites to destroy democracy? And more than that, on inequality, countries with a lot of inequality, can we say that not each person has one vote, but each dollar has one vote?
Yeah, no, well, that's why I think it's actually useful to think about this term of the role of competition, because on the one hand, you might think, well, this seems kind of too modest. Like, what's competition? I mean, there's all of these other problems, but to actually get genuine competition is a quite radical agenda, really, because what you're saying is that you need to equalize the resources that political actors have, that social actors have, that individuals have to assure fair competition. Now, how do you do that? I mean, I think that democracy is an imperfect tool, but you can have, one of the things that we at different moments in American history have had is kind of the progressive movement, which in the early 20th century, which aimed to break apart through antitrust regulation, monopoly regulation, the power of these big companies. I think actually under the Biden administration, there was a woman who was in charge of the antitrust, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, who was very aggressive in trying to prevent monopolies. It wouldn't using regulation to prevent monopolies, to try to prevent the consolidation of economic power. And in many ways, I think one might say that the reason that there was such support for the new president in 2024 from a lot of these economic interests is that they were suffering under this regime. And so, it's certainly not a perfect method, because you can always vote out those who are reforming to try to equalize the playing field, but these are the tools we have. And so I guess that the frustration with democracy comes, well, why do we have to suffer with these imperfect tools? Why can't we just figure out how to break apart these powerful concentrations of wealth? And I think that the reason, at the end of the day, I think that democracy is, although a frustratingly slow method of doing it, it's more effective than the alternatives, because the problem is the alternative methods of trying to do this ultimately lead to concentrations of political power themselves. And so, although they may work in the short run, come back to haunt us. So you can sort of think of any effort to do this in a kind of authoritarian fashion where there's not enough consensus on this, then there'll be kind of consolidations of power, I would say. So it's absolutely right that we need to set up rules in a way to insulate our rules from these major concentrations of wealth. And I think there's ways of designing rules in a society, antitrust regulations, regulatory structures, to make it so that competition is fair. If competition is fair, then fairer, at least, then it makes political competition fairer as well. And so let me give you a very concrete example. So in the United States, I mean, one of the problems we've seen the rise of this kind of economically powerful actors is that the courts in the United States, about a decade ago, decided that that regulating campaign expenditures at election time was a violation of free speech. And so this has opened the doors to massive expenditures of money, and that's weakened our democracy. And so we, on the other hand, if we had a set of rules, as many democracies do, that you can't give unrestricted campaign contributions to politicians, then I think our politics would be more insulated from these things. So there's ways of devising, not perfect rules, imperfect rules that improve the quality of our democracy.
And there's a paradox in one of those points that you said, and in this point is different in the United States and Brazil, which is about this freedom of speech. For instance, in the United States, if you want to record a video defending Nazis, you can do it. In Brazil, you cannot do it. You're not allowed to defend Nazism. And the question that is raised in Brazil is that the paradox is that you cannot have the freedom of speech to end freedom of speech. So you cannot use your freedom of speech to defend like a regime or to defend laws that will prohibit the freedom of speech. How do we deal with that? Because that's one of their main lines of argumentation, of discussion, is saying that, hey, you're trying to prohibit my freedom of speech. So you are the tyrant. You are the dictatorial.
Yes, right. No, I'm familiar with this debate in Brazil as well as in Germany, which has this idea that in English, in German, it's called Wehrhafte Demokratie, sometimes called militant democracy, which is very different than the US. You're right that where both freedom of speech is more easily limited. And also, in Germany, the constitution, the post-war constitution allows for political parties that attack the democratic order to be banned. A court can, in fact, ban them and disband them. And there's an active debate right now in Germany whether the radical right party, the AfD, the extreme right party, if it can be banned and dissolved. And there's lots of, because the idea is that if this party were to come into power, they would destroy the political democratic order. So we can't allow them even to compete. So, it's certainly and you're right that the U.S. doesn't have these tools to a degree. But what's interesting is that, I guess the response to that is to say in every democracy this exists. Even in the United States, there's limits on free speech. There are, and for most of American history, first of all, I should say the First Amendment only, protecting free speech, only applied to restrictions by the federal government. For most of American history, state governments and local governments could restrict as much free speech as they wanted. And even, more recently, there continue to be restrictions on free speech. You can't, there's defamation. One can be, if you have defamation and libel, there's limits on this. Violent threats can sometimes be prosecuted if they're very specific and so on. So there's conditions under which free speech is limited, even in the United States, the country of like the most free speech in the world, as well as in other democracies. So it's, there's sort of this fantasy that there's some place in which free speech exists totally unconstrained, and I just don't think that that's really right. That's the first point. The second point is similarly, I think there's, in terms of the banning of parties, and I think this is relevant in Brazil, certainly with Bolsonaro being banned from politics for 8 years. It's a kind of similar dynamic where, the United States also has things like this. So in the United States, there's the part of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which says that if somebody's engaged in insurrection, they can't revolt against the government, they can't hold federal office. And this has not really been used is the problem. We don't have any rules regulating it. And so when this issue was brought up before the Supreme Court last year, the court basically said that, we're not in a position to do this. And I can kind of understand it because we don't have any rules and regulations to kind of govern this. And so, there needs to be a set of rules in place where there's a very transparent process, a legalistic process, where if somebody has taken has assaulted democracy, then, in the same way that happened in South Korea, the president of South Korea tried to organize martial law, was impeached and removed from office. And so I think these kinds of things exist in most democracies. It is a bit of a dilemma, but, I would say what's interesting is that in any democracy, take the classic liberal democracy like the United States, where, let's say somebody proposes a legislation, majority wants the legislation. The court says, oh no, this is, let's say, banning gay marriage or something. The court intervenes and says, no, this is illegal. You can't do this. They're going against the will of the majority in that case. So in that case, you can, in fact, limit what the majority wants after the fact. This kind of idea of defensive or militant democracy means that you can limit the preferences of voters before the election. And that's what makes it controversial. But in some ways, it's not so different from liberal democracy. So in general, I still not, I spend a lot of time thinking about this militant democracy thing. I think there's often practical arguments against it. Like in the case, it's often a lot about timing. So in the United States, the problem was that rather than, immediately after January 6, 2021, had there been a legal process opened, which is something that Mitch McConnell, in fact, the head of the Republicans in the Senate, had said at the impeachment hearing, we're going to immediately open an investigation. That would have been one thing. But instead, they didn't. They waited with too much faith in American democracy, I would say, until Trump was then candidate and a likely winning candidate, and said, okay, now we're going to open a kind of banning. And that at that point, it was too late, I would say. It just was what really created problems of legitimacy that would have been counterproductive. I think in the Brazilian scenario, it's very different because the legal response was immediate. And so that way it has greater legitimacy, I would say. So in that sense, that was the kind of, I would say, more likely a right thing to do than what the Americans were trying to do.
When we go back to that poll that I told you, where most of the people understands democracy as a regime that has the aim to improve the living standards and well-being, and also on the same report, they show that the number of people that don't believe that democracy is the best regime has reached its highs on recent times. Can we say that the crisis of democracy is also a crisis of the capitalism regime, of the capitalism economic model?
I think the way I think about this is there's many ways, just as there's many ways to die, for a human to die, there's many ways for democracies to die. So democracies face many different kinds of challenges. And I think the levels of inequality and the role of economic elites in undermining political equality is one kind of challenge. But I don't think it describes every scenario, because I think, in fact, there's other ways for democracy to get into trouble. I mean, back in 2016, when candidate Trump was running for the Republican nomination for office, he was not the candidate of the oligarchs. He was not the candidates of big business. Big business was on the side of Jeb Bush and the establishment politicians. And they were afraid, in some sense, of Trump because he was unpredictable. So he won despite their preferences, not because of their preferences. Now, it's true that now once he's in office, they kind of rally to his defense and so on. So I think that's one of the vulnerabilities. And another way in which capitalism, so one is this concentrations of wealth. Another way that capitalism poses some difficulties for democracy and challenges for democracy is the kind of sense of people who have been left behind and who don't accept the political order and feel the government's not accountable are more tempted to vote for demagogues. And so I think that's also a problem. But I also think there's some ways in which capitalism, if it by capitalism we mean fair, and this gets into a kind of broader debate perhaps, but if it's possible to have capitalism where you have not monopoly capitalism, but in fact, diversified economy where you have different firms competing with each other, this is can give rise to a kind of pluralism that maybe can help bolster democracy. Or at least that's the theory I've always gone by, that having a diverse, heterogeneous private sector can provide bulwarks of authority outside of the state. And so in some instances, this can help defend democracy. Or that's what I've hoped. I mean, in some ways, I think what we're witnessing in the United States is a test of that theory. Because
in a sense, that means that shifting the direction of capitalism will also shift the direction of democracy, right?
Yeah, well, if capitalism is made more equal, if it's made, so that you don't have a kind of monopoly capitalism. Mm-hmm. I think a monopoly capitalism is much more compatible with monopoly politics or authoritarianism, because as an authoritarian, all you have to do is buy off like 5 corporate heads and you've won the game. If you're in a system in which concentration is not wealth is not concentrated in the hands of 6 tech oligarchs, and you actually have to deal with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millionaires and billionaires, then it's much harder to buy those groups off. I think that you're right that one problem with American democracy is there's just too many billionaires. I mean, that's one way of putting it, right? And so and they have too much power. So I think if we had a capitalist system that was more equitable, and I think there are varieties of capitalism. I mean, there's some systems in which you have a kind of reformed capitalism where there's less inequality, where there's less concentrations of wealth. And I think if you have that kind of capitalism, I think that helps sustain a more stable democracy as well.
And talking about demographics a little bit, there's an interesting phenomenon happening all over the world with the young people. Basically, young people are becoming more conservative, but there's also another interesting factor, which is the difference between young women and young men. Young men are becoming each time more conservative and more tied to religious dogmas. And young women are becoming more progressive, and in many countries, like in Brazil, they have saved democracy. What's happening with the young people in the world, and what does it mean in terms of the direction the world is taking?
Yeah, it's a real challenge to our conventional wisdom that young people are always more liberal. I mean, that seems not to be the case. And I've begun to do some research of this on this topic myself, and so beginning to design surveys. And looking at some survey results of other scholars, one of the things that I've noticed, and with it, just take Europe for instance, that there's different patterns in different countries, and I think they're very revealing. So the gender gap in politics seems to have been less, for instance, in places where women had already entered the labor markets, and so were already in positions of employment, longer ago, where the gap between male and female labor market participation was less. But in places, let's say like Germany, many kind of more conservative economies, Germany, Catholic countries, where there's a big gap where women entered the labor market much later. As the economy slows down, and as there's other pressures, men increasingly view women, this is my potential explanation, we view women as a threat to their status, because women are entering the labor market in a kind of precarious time. And so they're more likely to vote for radical right parties. In places where women have already entered the labor market early, and often in social democratic countries of Scandinavia, and for different reasons in the United States, there seemed to be actually less of a gender gap. So that's just an initial finding that I've found in politics. So that's a kind of economic explanation. That's one thing. I think there's another factor at work, though, which, I mean, some people have, and I have less kind of data to support this, but a hunch or hypothesis that I have is that social media consumption patterns maybe play a role here, and in people's relationships, personal relationships, that there's a kind of, people talk about a crisis of male youth, and I think there's some way in which the way that young men interact with technology than young women, that there's some way in which men are more isolated. I mean, we've heard reports about this as well, and so it makes them more vulnerable to demagogues and authoritarians, and feel a sense of social isolation. But we're really only at the beginning stages of knowing what's happening. But I think it's really an important phenomenon that we really need to get our grip on, because these are the few voters of the future, and so we need to understand what's happening.
And what is the role of religion on that? Because in Brazil, the extreme right was very tied to the evangelical churches. I know that in the United States, the other day I saw a video inside the White House, people doing a cult and something which is not normal. People didn't used to do that some time ago. And many of these countries where the extreme right has raised to an important political position have this coalition with those people from the politics and the leaders of those religions. What is the role of religion on the death of democracies?
Yeah, so it does vary from country to country, but I think in the United States, it's tied up with the demographic change that's come to the United States. So beginning in the 1960s, American politics was dominated by white and Christian people. African Americans in many parts of the United States didn't have the right to vote, and there hadn't been much migration. But beginning in 1965, you had a massive influx of new migrants from all around the world. African Americans gained the right to vote. And so, and both African Americans and the new migrants and their children tended to vote for the Democratic Party in the United States. The Republican Party remained a mostly white and Christian party. And as an electoral strategy, the Republican Party, beginning in the 1970s, very actively made the choice, and this was clearly the case with Richard Nixon in the early 70s, and even up through Reagan, that we're going to double down on the strategy of defending white Christians. And part of that meant making appeals to evangelical Christians. And so, many of the evangelical Christian schools, for instance, in the United States, in the US South, were formed in response to desegregation. As schools were integrated, black and white schools in the US South, in the public schools, there were many people, whites, Christians, conservatives, who were not happy about having to send their children to integrated schools. So what they did is they set up private religious schools. And so these are the schools that were sort of the foundation of the evangelical movement in the United States. And so it's very much in the United States, at least, very different in Brazil, I think. tied up with race, that there's a kind of white Christian conception, evangelical Protestant conception of what it means to be an American, very much tied up with the Republican Party. And I think this is really what's dominated our politics up through the 21st century. And I think what happened when America was majority white Christian country, this is a viable electoral strategy. I mean, the percentage of Ronald Reagan's voters who were evangelical white Christians was extremely high, and this was the case all the way through the 1990s. What one sees, though, as America has become more diverse, is that segment of the electorate, evangelical white Christians, has diminished as a percentage of the population. And so what makes the Trump phenomenon so fascinating in a way is that it's begun to make inroads into other communities, not only white evangelical Christians, but perhaps like Brazil. I mean, you can tell me, I don't know as much about this, but but in Brazil, these divides are not about race and ethnicity, but much more about religion. And so in some sense, there's a kind of convergence potentially of Brazil and the United States on this.
Yes, the evangelical churches in Brazil, who were inspired by the evangelical church in the US, they are really rich, they're really powerful, and their leaders are very dogmatic, very radical, and they tied up with Bolsonaro. So most of the rallies of Bolsonaro and most of the events where he speaks, he always speaks besides like a leader, a religious leader in Brazil. And over the past decades, we had a huge increase of the percentage of people who declare themselves to be evangelical. You know, I have another question here. Yes,
well,
yes,
can I just say one thing on this? So this pattern of parties of the right using religion to mobilize voters is not a new strategy. In fact, I mean, it goes back even to the 19th century. I mean, back in the 19th century, the British Conservative Party, a very different kind of party, certainly, was a party of aristocrats and landed elites in the 19th century. In order to appeal to middle-class voters, really began to make itself the party that defended the Anglican Church, and so used the same kind of strategies of including religious figures at their campaign events and saying we're defending the church against the secular opposition. And so, this is a way for parties of the right to broaden their appeal, because in many ways, if you're a party of the right that has at its core often economic elites, that's not a way to win elections in a democracy. So one way of broadening the appeal is to make religious appeals and say you're a party that not only defends, capitalism, but you're also a party that defends traditional values as found in these kinds of religious communities. So I just wanted to say there's a longer thread of this history.
No, it's important. And when you go back to fascism and Nazism too, and also here in Brazil, it's funny because they don't put communism as a threat because it's authoritarian, because it's totalitarian. They put communism as a threat because they don't believe in God. And that is much more powerful in Brazil than any other threat that you put, which shows the importance of the religious factor here.
Very interesting.
One question here. We're watching in the world dispute for the economic leadership of the planet between United States and China. Both of them have like a very different political regime. But if you look at the standard of living for Americans and for Chinese people over the last like 3 decades, I think we can probably say that Chinese people saw an improvement of their standard of living much higher than the American people. Is there also a dispute of a political regime, and can that interfere on people's views on democracy?
Yeah, so you're right that the rates of economic growth in China have been very high, over the last decades, and in many ways, this is the kind of pattern of a successful economy that starts at a lower point that grows more rapidly. And in early stages of industrialization, in many ways, this often happens. This happened in the case of the United States, in case of England, in case of Germany, and so on. So I'm not sure. I think it's probably clear that the political model of China helped that industrialization because it helped this kind of massive planned industrialization and development. Whether that remains a better political model over the long run, I think, is the question in a sense that you're asking. And my sense is that the evidence among scholars, it's important, I guess, we'll put it this way. It's important to not just pick one country and another country and try to infer from that the models, because, one could say, well, like Singapore is doing very well in its authoritarian economically, but for every Singapore, there's a very poor authoritarian country that's not doing very well. And so, one has to kind of compare countries that are kind of analogous in many ways. And so, if you compare a kind of modal African, sub-Saharan African country that has had a rough political regime and lots of authoritarianism, they may be underdeveloped and they're not having the skyrocket economic growth in the same way, or they haven't over certain decades. So on average, one has to look in a sense on average, and on average, the evidence is kind of mixed, I would say. I mean, there's some scholars who really want to show that democracies perform better economically than authoritarian systems. But I have to say, I mean, my reading of the literature, there's not really conclusive evidence on this. I mean, it depends on the time frame. It depends on the sample of countries you look at. There's some scholars who've demonstrated that democracies have an advantage. There's others who've said that autocracies have an advantage. So I don't really feel like I'm in a good position to kind of conclusively make the case that I would like to make, which is that democracies are better economically performing. There are certain things that democracies are undoubtedly better at, and I think economic technological innovation is one. If you look at the number of patents, by country, it's clear that democracies outperform autocracies. And dealing with certain kinds of health crises, famines, democracies are better than at dealing with these than autocracies. So there is a competition. You're right, in front of us. So I like to make the case that essentially the way I answer this question is to say that that the most conservative estimate is that democracies are at least as good as autocracies at economic growth. There's some evidence that democracies are actually better than autocracies, but it's not like a clear cut no contest kind of point. So we have to also make the case for democracies along other dimensions, and those other dimensions are, number one, the protection of basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of consciousness, freedom to be critical of the government. These are freedoms that maybe some people don't value, but I know I value, and I know lots of other people value. If you've lived in an authoritarian system, you felt the heavy weight of feeling like you can't criticize governments, then you kind of know this is something you value. Democracies are better at protecting this than any kind of authoritarian system. Then also, although you said that most voters don't care about voting governments out of power, I think that is really, that's sort of a value that people take for granted. I think there's an incredible power of being able to vote bad leaders out of power. If you have a bad leader in an authoritarian system, you just, there's nothing you can do about it except violent revolt. You can't peacefully get rid of leaders. So I think, and these are kind of non-economic reasons for why I would prefer to live in a democracy than an authoritarian system. And so I think it's important to emphasize those as well. Now, the question is, in a way, what happens if American democracy is backsliding? And I think many of the things that international world doesn't like about what America is doing in the world today are due to its increasing authoritarianism. I mean, its trade policies reflect an unconstrained president. Or think about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This is about an unconstrained executive. I mean, I think when a large country, a big country, a powerful country has a weakened democracy, then that country is more likely to behave as a bad actor on the international stage. And so I think, we want all countries to be democracies, but I think it's also very important for big countries to remain democracies for the sake of the rest of the international system.
Okay, that's a very good answer. I have just a few more questions for you, and one of them is that Donald Trump is now talking about a third term. Actually, Steve Bannon told about his third term. Do you think that is possible? And if that happens, what do you think will be the consequences of that for the United States and for the world?
Well, it's unconstitutional. So in that sense, it's impossible. But, certain things are possible even if they're unconstitutional. So that would obviously be a major crisis if that were to happen. It's clearly unconstitutional. I mean, there's kind of crazy ideas out there about why it's actually constitutional, but it's not constitutional. If there's some movement in that direction, I expect major pushback against it. It's pretty clearly laid out in our constitution that you can only run for two terms. I mean, there are these kind of theories where J.D. Vance runs for president and then he resigns, and Donald Trump runs as vice president so he can become president without running for a third term. This is clearly, so the question would be, how would the courts rule on this? Either you have to change the constitution. The courts, I guess, would probably reject this reasoning. So if the president is willing to defy the courts to do this, then clearly we're in a crisis situation. Not only because he's running for a third term, but because he's defying the courts. So this is not at the top of my list of things that I'm worrying about right now. I mean, I guess, maybe somebody should be thinking about this, but I think to prevent that kind of thing from happening, we need to confront the challenges that are confronting our democracy every day, like now, this week, next week, the week after that, winning the next elections and so on. I think that's the best way to deal with that problem.
I love your definition that democracy is not the regime that guarantees you choose the best one, but is a regime that guarantees that you can take off those that are not doing great. I love that. It's a very nice way of seeing it. And one thing that you said, I think it's impossible. When I was a trader, I used to work on the financial markets. And when I was a trader, they always said, in the markets, the unthinkable and impossible happens now and then, So in politics, I think the unthinkable and impossible happens now and then too.
Right, I agree. And this idea that when you say something's impossible, that's the moment you need to get worried, I guess, right? But I mean, it's because somebody's asked you about it, so it's in somebody's head. But I think it's important to. I mean, the reason I say it's impossible is that I think it's important to not normalize this as a kind of viable thing. I mean, I think it's really important to say this is beyond the pale. This is unacceptable. We'd be in a crisis if this were to happen.
And as my last question, we didn't talk here about a tyrant that might be growing under our noses and getting bigger, more important, more relevant, and might, in not a long time, rule many countries, which is artificial intelligence. I've heard and read articles in many places already talking about a time when we won't be run by politicians, we would be run by systems. It might look like science fiction now, but I don't think that is impossible. Again, the impossible and the unthinkable, right? But as they are, the perception that people have that artificial intelligence is unbiased, that is much more capable than humans, it's much more fair, it's much more mathematical, analytical, might make this scenario a possible scenario. But that will also be run by a tyrant, because no one will ever argue against an artificial intelligence as it would be like God on earth that know all the answers, all the right answers. Isn't that a threat for democracies as well?
Yeah, it is. And I think people should begin to think about this. I have to admit, I don't have anything I haven't thought enough about this myself to say something original, but I see the point, because, if democracy is ruled by the people and it's not ruled by, Aristotle had these different kinds of governments, ruled by the elite, ruled by a single leader, ruled by the wealthy, ruled by the people. One thing he didn't have, so this is, everybody often says Aristotle said everything. We don't need to know. We can just always go back to Aristotle. One thing Aristotle, I think, that didn't talk about was rule by technology. And so I think that's a kind of challenge that we haven't really thought enough about. And in some ways, we already confront the challenge. So it's not a distant future challenge. I mean, there's ways in which, we already defer to technology in ways that we're not even aware of, in shaping of our own preferences. But I think one of the things, I guess, that this makes me think of, maybe the one comment I can make about it is that one of the key demands of human beings is for some kind of, when they want to hand power over to somebody else, is a demand for legitimacy. They expect that whatever the entity is that's ruling them, that's issuing commands, that's making them do things that they don't want to do, has the right to issue those commands. That there's some perception that this authority deserves to be in this position. You know, a king has the right to do this because people sort of think the king, you know, is related to God or something. The bureaucrat has the right to issue a command because they're delivering for you. The democratically elected leader has the right to issue commands because they've been elected. You accept the procedures by which they're selected. And so the question, I think, for technology will be, can technology really offer the mechanism of legitimacy that is necessary? And so this may be the vulnerability, you know, because if the only legitimacy that a technology can offer, I would say, is a kind of output legitimacy where it delivers better outcomes. You're willing to accept handing authority over to this entity because it delivers better outcomes. Now, the problem with technology is, and you know, just as you say, you know, the impossible can become possible. I mean, one, I guess, iron law of human existence since the time of Aristotle is that technology sometimes fails. It's not perfect. And if artificial intelligence is technology and it sometimes fails, if its only basis of legitimacy is its ability to perform well, this will create a problem. And so that's one of the beauties, I would say, of democracy, is that if the procedures are working well, even when governments fail, there's an outlet, as we just said. You know, there's an outlet. You can throw the person out. If AI is technology is that it's perfect, it doesn't make mistakes. When it makes mistakes, what's its basis of power? So I think that's sort of an area to maybe think about. Again, this is first initial thoughts about this.
Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure that dozens of thousands of people that are watching us are very happy and very honored to have a scholar of your level here with us. Congratulations for your books, and our house here is always open for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it a lot. Because democracy can't survive if major political parties are not committed to playing by democratic rules.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Let's see how they do.
But the question still remains, how did this happen?
Vamos fuzilar a petralhada aqui do Acre.
Elections, which maybe seem like moments of clarity, now feel like a national emergency because we don't know how the other side's going to accept the results. So in the end, what do we do to save democracy? So the strength of democracy is not that it produces the best leaders, but it allows for failure, and it allows then for replacement. The mainstream parties of the center-right and the center-left tolerate, protect, or enable violent, extremist, anti-democratic forces, and democracies tend to get into trouble. So regular elections, judicial independence, a free press, pluralism, these aren't just kind of lofty ideals, they're really kind of circuit breakers, I would say. They keep power from being permanent. This is only possible if democracy survives.
Pois é, essa aula inédita do Daniel Zibblat, que não é essa que vocês assistiram hoje. Essa que vocês assistiram hoje é uma aula que eu conduzi ali para trazer perguntas, né, que tivessem a ver com a nossa situação aqui hoje no Brasil, com o que a gente está vendo acontecer nos Estados Unidos. Mas essa aula do Daniel Zibblat, ela já está junto com mais de 5.000 aulas que a gente tem no Instituto Conhecimento Liberta. E, gente, é tão importante a gente entender o que a gente está conseguindo com essa comunidade. O ICL, no começo, ele era um projeto revolucionário. Hoje ele é revolucionário e único. Não existe nenhum outro projeto no mundo que ofereça isso que a gente resolveu oferecer para as pessoas, como nessa aula que vocês assistiram hoje, que são aulas com os maiores professores do mundo, cursos de formação, com trilhas de aprendizado, que nem vocês têm numa universidade, né? Então, hoje você tem mais de 5.000 aulas e que correspondem a mais de 300 cursos. Então, alguns dos professores que a gente tem, Gessé Souza, um dos maiores sociólogos do Brasil, está aqui, ó, essa aula do Ícaro aqui no ICL é a que faz mais sucesso, é sobre inteligência artificial, porque hoje em dia é um tema muito do momento, e a gente tem se dedicado muito a esclarecer as pessoas sobre as questões de inteligência artificial. Marilena Chauí, Barry Schwartz, um dos maiores psicólogos do mundo em inteligência comportamental e psicologia social, a aula também aqui pra gente, exclusiva para o ICL, essa aula gravada, com a filha do Mohamed Ali, com a Nancy Fraser, com o Leonardo Boff, Cornel West, vocês conhecem, foi candidato à presidência dos Estados Unidos, Elliot Aronson, o maior psicólogo social do mundo, aulas de Excel, aulas com Chomsky, aulas de psicanálise, aulas com Eduardo Marinho sobre filosofia das ruas. Então, gente, assim, a gente acredita, a gente de verdade, e essa comunidade que é cada vez maior acredita junto com a gente, por isso que a gente já conseguiu construir tanto. A gente acredita que só tem um jeito